Welcome to this webinar series on V3 Discovery. As a reminder, the core of Discovery is really translating what the student currently does into variables that will help support competitive integrated employment. And we've organized those variables into the 4 C's. So no matter what step you're on, no matter what kind of information you're gathering, we're really trying to frame those into what does this tell us about the individual's interests and preferences that we've titled choices. What information have we gathered about the student's skills or abilities that could be contributions to a potential employer? What might be the conditions for employment? So really reframing barriers or reframing those challenges into conditions for employment. And who does the student know? Who do they hang out with? Who does the family hang out with that could be potential social capital to be able to use to make those connections to employment? So if you remember from the introductory webinar, the V3 Discovery Process Checklist is your overarching guide to the entire process. So I encourage you to keep that front and center as you're going through the various steps of the process, and you can keep track of where you are and make notes about who's doing what and what information you're wanting to gather during that step. This webinar is about step 1, preparation. So we're going to walk through the activities related to preparation for the discovery process. So the first couple sub-steps in the step of preparation is selecting a target student and identifying the team to help support the process. If you are doing this as part of a professional learning, then you're selecting a target student and putting a team together to practice the process. When you embed this process as just part of your overarching transition planning work, then obviously the students that you identify that would benefit from discovery are already identified, and that team is your IEP team. It's just important to always make sure, with parent permission, that you include any agencies that are likely to pay for or provide for transition services, both while the student is still in school and certainly after the student exits. And so this tool is a way to capture who's all participating in the process, and it's really important to identify a team leader because there's lots of moving parts in the process, and though we're walking through the steps in a sequential way, you don't necessarily have to do these first few steps in that sequential way. You can be collecting interview and survey data at the same time that you're doing observations. And so in that regard, there may be a lot of moving parts, and it's good to have someone who's sort of overseeing the entire process. So once you have your team identified, then you'll want to set up a meeting schedule. We really suggest meeting at least monthly, or at least touching base in some way monthly. You can do that via Skype or Zoom or even email, preferably in person, to really go through where people are in the process and what are the next steps in establishing new action items. But the more regularly you touch base, the more you'll keep on a time schedule for getting the process completed. We also think it's important, if you do have team members that aren't familiar with the discovery broadly, there are some resources to access to bring people up to speed on what is discovery more nationally. And I'll show you those resources here in just a second. And then also establish any additional outcomes. Obviously, you're going to have the 3 V's as outcomes, which would be your vision, your post-secondary goals, your vocational profile, and your visual resume. But you may have additional goals that you'd like to work on. For example, maybe you want to focus on independent living, or the student is planning to go off to a community college or a tech school and you want to focus on that. So absolutely feel free to add to your checklist additional outcomes you would like to occur. And here are links to some of those resources if you have members of your team that aren't familiar with discovery, or you want to dig in further on discovery nationally. So the last sub-step in the step of preparation is really the first time we're going to start doing something where we're going to translate information into the 4 C's, and that is doing the records review. So in your materials for step 1 is a V3 Discovery record review documentation form. So when you go to do your records review, so you are gathering, looking through the CA60, gathering any other behavior data or assessment reports or documentation from agencies that have been providing services. Whatever that documentation is that you're reviewing, you can either pull out that 4Cs visual organizer that we talked about at the beginning and just document that information there and use this as a guide, or you can actually kind of tick through the items on this documentation form to gather that information. So that wraps up the preparation step for the V3 Discovery process. The next webinar that you will watch and the next step in the process, step 2, will be the interviews and surveys.